Mom, did the checks I mailed every month help with your medical bills? My son asked over Thanksgiving dinner. I nearly dropped the gravy boat. What checks, Daniel? I've never received any money from you. My daughter-in-law slowly lowered her wine glass and stared at the table. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me what city you're watching from. Because what happened that Thanksgiving shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. For the past 3 years, I'd been surviving on a receptionist salary at a small dental office in Columbus, Ohio. At 68 years old, I still answered phones 40 hours a week because retirement simply wasn't an option anymore. My husband Frank had passed away from heart failure 5 years earlier, and the savings we'd built together disappeared faster than I ever imagined possible. Medical bills, property taxes, repairs on the old Ford Escape that coughed every winter morning before finally starting. Some months, I had exactly $20 left after paying utilities. Still, I never complained to my son. Daniel had done well for himself. Better than well, honestly. At 39, he owned a thriving logistics company outside Chicago. He wore tailored suits now and traveled for business conferences in places I'd only seen on television. Every time he called, he sounded rushed, but loving in that distracted way successful people sometimes do. Love you, Mom. I'll call next week. Then next week became next month. And after he married Vanessa, things changed even more. Not overnight. That's the dangerous part. Distance rarely arrives like a storm. It comes quietly, one missed visit at a time. Vanessa was polished, beautiful, the kind of woman who never had a hair out of place. At family dinners, she spoke softly, but somehow controlled every conversation anyway. If Daniel suggested visiting me for Christmas, Vanessa already had ski reservations in Aspen. If he planned a weekend trip home, suddenly her parents needed help with something urgent. I told myself that was normal. Young couples build their own lives. That's what widowed mothers are supposed to say. Thanksgiving that year felt especially important because Daniel hadn't visited in nearly 6 months. I woke up before sunrise to prepare everything from scratch. Turkey with rosemary butter, sweet potato casserole, homemade cranberry sauce the way Frank loved it. The grocery bill nearly gave me heart palpitations. I stood in aisle 7 at Kroger holding a package of pecans, debating whether I could afford them. In the end, I bought them anyway because Daniel used to steal toasted pecans from the baking tray when he was little. Some memories are expensive. By noon, my little house smelled like cinnamon and sage. I even pulled out the good china Frank's mother left me 30 years ago. One plate had a crack running through the edge, but I turned it carefully so nobody would notice. At exactly 2:14 p.m., Daniel's black SUV pulled into my driveway. I watched from the kitchen window, wiping my hands nervously on a dish towel. Daniel climbed out first, tall and confident in a charcoal peacoat. Vanessa followed beside him wearing cream-colored boots that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. Even from the window, she looked flawless. When I opened the front door, Daniel hugged me tightly. "Mom, you look good. You always say that when I look tired," I teased. He laughed, but Vanessa only smiled politely before handing me a tiny bakery box. "Gluten-free pie," she explained. "Daniel's trying to cut sugar." I glanced at the pumpkin pie cooling on my counter and forced a smile. Well, one day won't kill him. Something flickered across her face, then disappeared. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Daniel talked about expanding his company into Texas. Vanessa described a luxury resort they'd visited in Cabo that had private infinity pools overlooking the ocean. I nodded and smiled at all the appropriate moments while quietly calculating whether I could afford heating oil through January. That's the strange thing about family dinners. Sometimes two completely different worlds sit at the same table pretending they understand each other. Halfway through dessert, Daniel leaned back in his chair with a satisfied sigh. "This reminds me," he said casually. "I've been wanting to ask if the monthly checks were enough." I frowned. "What monthly checks?" "The ones I've been sending you since your surgery last year." The room went silent. I laughed softly because surely I misunderstood. "Daniel, honey, I haven't had surgery." His smile faded. "No, after your knee replacement. Vanessa said recovery was rough and you needed help with expenses." The fork slipped from my fingers onto the plate. "Knee replacement?" Vanessa suddenly reached for her wine glass. "Daniel," she interrupted lightly, "maybe your mom forgot. I never had knee surgery," I said slowly. Daniel stared at me, then at Vanessa, then back at me. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. My chest tightened. Sweetheart, the only procedure I've had was a root canal 2 years ago. Vanessa stood abruptly. I should make that phone call, she muttered. My mother's probably waiting. But something about the speed of her movement made my stomach twist. Daniel's expression changed completely. The relaxed holiday warmth vanished from his face, replaced by the sharp, calculating look I imagined he used in boardrooms. Mom, he said carefully, I've been sending you $3,000 every month for over a year. I blinked at him. $3,000. Every month. The number didn't even feel real. That was more money than I earned in 2 months answering phones at the dental office. That's impossible, I whispered. I wired it directly to your account. I don't have any extra money, Daniel. My voice cracked despite my efforts. I'm 3 months behind on my prescriptions. The color drained from his face. Behind us, Vanessa froze in the kitchen doorway. For one long, terrible second, nobody moved. The ticking clock above my refrigerator suddenly sounded deafening. Daniel slowly pulled out his phone. I have the transfers, he said. Every single confirmation. My hands began trembling. I thought about the nights I'd eaten canned soup because groceries were too expensive. The winter I kept my thermostat at 62 degrees to save money. The collection notice folded inside my purse because I couldn't pay the cardiologist. And all that time, my son believed he'd been helping me. Show me, I whispered. Daniel opened his banking app with shaking fingers. Line after line appeared on the screen. $3,000 transferred. $3,000 transferred. $3,000 transferred. Every month. For 14 months. I felt dizzy. That account number, I said quietly. That's not mine. Daniel looked up sharply. What? My checking account ends in 8814. He stared at the screen. The account on his phone ended in 4421. Slowly, almost mechanically, Daniel turned toward the kitchen. Vanessa stood perfectly still beside the counter, one manicured hand gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Vanessa, he said carefully, why isn't this Mom's account? She swallowed hard. And in that moment, before she said a single word, I knew. I knew my daughter-in-law had stolen every dollar meant for me. And suddenly, Thanksgiving dinner no longer felt warm or safe. It felt like the beginning of a war. Vanessa let out a nervous little laugh. The kind people use when they think they can still talk their way out of disaster. There has to be some misunderstanding, she said quickly. Daniel, maybe the bank mixed something up. But her voice sounded too sharp, too rehearsed. Daniel stood slowly from the table. No, he said quietly. Banks don't accidentally send $42,000 to the wrong person for over a year. $42,000. Hearing the number out loud made my stomach twist. $42,000 while I clipped coupons for canned soup. $42,000 while I sat in the dark some evenings because I was afraid to run the heater too long. I suddenly felt embarrassed remembering all the times I told Daniel I was doing just fine. Not because I had been fine, but because mothers from my generation were raised to survive quietly. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly over her chest. I was trying to help, she muttered. Daniel stared at her. What does that even mean? She glanced at me briefly before looking away. My parents needed money after my dad lost his business, she said. You know that. Daniel's jaw tightened. So you stole from my mother? I borrowed it. Vanessa snapped suddenly. There's a difference. The room went silent. Again. Borrowed. That word landed harder than yelling would have. Borrowed suggested she believed she had a right to it. I looked at her standing there in her expensive cream sweater, diamond earrings catching the kitchen light, and suddenly dozens of little memories started rearranging themselves inside my head. The canceled visits. The awkward phone calls. The way she always answered questions for Daniel before he could speak himself. Things I ignored because I wanted peace. Now they felt different. Now they felt intentional. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. How long? He asked quietly. Vanessa hesitated. That's not important. How long, Vanessa? Since last September. My breath caught. 14 months. 14 months of lies. Daniel turned toward me slowly, and the pain in his face nearly broke my heart. Mom, he whispered, why didn't you tell me you were struggling? I almost laughed at the question. Not because it was funny, because children never realize how carefully mothers hide hardship from them. I didn't want to burden you, I said softly. His eyes filled immediately. Behind him, Thanksgiving dinner sat untouched on the table. The turkey I'd basted every 30 minutes. The stuffing Frank taught me to make during our second year of marriage. Everything suddenly looked tired. Old. like a photograph from someone else's life. Daniel walked toward the kitchen island where Vanessa stood frozen. You told me Mom had surgery. She needed help anyway. You told me she moved banks. She's older, Daniel. I figured she wouldn't notice. That sentence hit harder than anything else she'd said all evening. Older. Like age made theft acceptable. Like loneliness made people invisible. I felt something cold settle quietly inside my chest then. Not rage exactly. Clarity. Daniel stepped back from his wife as though he no longer recognized her. You forged my mother's banking information? Vanessa's composure finally cracked. Oh my God, stop making me sound like some criminal, she burst out. You have no idea what kind of pressure I was under. I flinched slightly at the volume. She immediately noticed. For a split second, guilt crossed her face. Then it disappeared again. My father's medical bills were crushing us, she continued rapidly. My brother lost his apartment. We were drowning, Daniel. And my mother wasn't, he shot back. Vanessa looked at me then. Really looked at me for the first time all evening. I wondered what she saw. A tired old widow in a faded burgundy sweater. Gray roots beginning to show near my temples because salon visits had become a luxury. A woman who still drove a 12-year-old SUV with duct tape holding part of the rear bumper together. Maybe that was the problem. People stopped seeing older women as people. We become background furniture in our own families. I was going to pay it back, she said quietly. When? Daniel asked. No answer. The silence stretched so long the refrigerator motor kicked on behind us. Finally, I pushed my chair back gently and stood. My knees ached immediately. I suddenly felt every one of my 68 years. I think, I said carefully, maybe we should finish dinner before everything gets colder. Daniel stared at me in disbelief. Mom, what else is there to say tonight? Vanessa looked relieved by my calmness. I could see it immediately. That was her mistake. People always underestimate quiet women. We sat back down at the table, though nobody really ate anymore. Daniel picked at his food without looking up. Vanessa barely touched her plate. I kept serving mashed potatoes automatically because my hands needed something to do. Outside, snow had started falling lightly across my front yard. Frank used to love the first snowfall of the year. For a moment, I imagined what he would say if he were sitting beside me now. Probably something calm and practical. Frank believed anger should arrive slowly. That night, after dessert dishes sat untouched in the sink, Daniel asked quietly if he could see my bills. At first I resisted. Pride is a stubborn thing. But eventually I pulled the stack from the kitchen drawer near the microwave. Electric notices, prescription receipts, past due statements folded carefully in half. Daniel went through them silently one by one. The deeper he looked, the paler he became. You skipped your heart medication twice last month, he asked finally. I looked down at my hands. It was expensive. Jesus Christ. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably beside him. Daniel suddenly slammed the papers onto the table hard enough to make me jump. All this time, he said hoarsely, turning toward his wife, you watched my mother live like this? Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. I said I was sorry. No, he replied coldly. You said you were stressed. The difference mattered. A lot. For the first time since arriving that afternoon, Vanessa had absolutely nothing to say. And sitting there in my tiny kitchen with snow falling outside and unpaid bills spread across the table, I realized something painful. The hardest part wasn't losing money. It was understanding that someone I welcomed into my family had watched me suffer and chose herself every single time Daniel and Vanessa left my house just after 10 that night. The moment their SUV disappeared down the snowy street, the silence inside my home felt overwhelming. Not peaceful, not comforting, heavy. Like the walls themselves had heard everything. I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the stack of unpaid bills still spread across the table. My coffee mug had gone cold hours earlier, but I picked it up anyway out of habit. My hands were shaking. Not because of the money, because of the betrayal. There's something deeply painful about realizing your suffering was invisible to someone sitting at your own dinner table. I slowly began cleaning up Thanksgiving dinner alone. The turkey went into plastic containers. The mashed potatoes into old Tupperware with faded lids. Outside, snow continued drifting quietly across the driveway while my dishwasher hummed softly in the background. 5 years earlier, Frank would have stood beside me drying dishes and sneaking bites of pie when he thought I wasn't looking. Now it was just me. And the terrible realization that my son's wife had been stealing from me for over a year while smiling across holiday tables. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. Daniel. I hesitated before answering. Mom. His voice sounded wrecked. I'm sorry, he whispered immediately. I am so sorry. I leaned against the kitchen counter and closed my eyes. You didn't know? I should have known. There was movement on his end. A car door shutting. Then silence again. Finally he spoke. I dropped Vanessa at a hotel. That surprised me. Not because I thought he'd forgive her quickly. Because Daniel hated conflict. Even as a little boy, he used to cry if kids argued on the playground. What happens now? I asked quietly. I don't know. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. For a moment, he sounded 10 years old again. I keep replaying everything in my head, he admitted. Every time she told me you were fine. Every time she said you didn't want help. God, Mom, I didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was harder than either of us wanted to admit. Vanessa didn't create the distance between us alone. Daniel allowed it. Maybe unknowingly. Maybe slowly. But still, I should have called more, he whispered. That hurt more than yelling would have. Because it was true. After we hung up, I sat in the dark living room for a long time listening to the grandfather clock tick beside the fireplace. Frank bought that clock at an estate sale during our 25th wedding anniversary weekend. He spent 3 days repairing the mechanism himself because he refused to pay someone else. You never throw away something built with care, he always said. I wondered what he would think about families now. About marriages. About loyalty. Around 1 in the morning, I finally climbed the stairs to bed, but sleep never really came. Instead, memories did. Little moments I'd ignored over the years. The Christmas Vanessa insisted they spend in Aspen because the kids deserved real holiday experiences. The birthday dinner Daniel canceled 30 minutes beforehand because Vanessa supposedly had a migraine. The time I mailed my grandson Ethan a handmade sweater, only for Vanessa to casually mention later that it accidentally got donated. At the time, I convinced myself none of it mattered. Older women become experts at swallowing disappointment. We call it maturity. Sometimes it's just loneliness wearing a polite dress. The next morning, I woke up exhausted. My body ached from stress, and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. For a few seconds, lying in bed beneath my faded floral comforter, I almost convinced myself Thanksgiving had been a nightmare. Then I noticed the unopened bills still sitting on my dresser. Reality returned immediately. By 8:30, I was at the dental office answering phones like usual. Good morning, Bright Smile Dental. This is Margaret speaking. My voice sounded cheerful enough that nobody noticed anything wrong. That's another thing women my age learn early. The world still expects you to function while your heart breaks. Patients checked in. Insurance calls piled up. Dr. Klein complained about scheduling delays. And all morning, I kept thinking about $42,000. $42,000 could have replaced my leaking roof. It could have paid off my medical debt. It could have let me retire. Around lunchtime, my coworker Linda sat beside me in the break room holding a yogurt parfait. You okay, Maggie? She asked gently. You seem tired. I smiled automatically. Just holiday stress. She nodded sympathetically. Nobody asks too many questions when older women say they're tired. People assume exhaustion is simply part of aging. At 2:15, my cell phone rang again. Vanessa. I stared at her name flashing across the screen for several seconds before answering. Hello. Silence. Then soft crying. Margaret, she whispered. Please let me explain. I walked slowly toward the empty consultation room near the back office. There's a special kind of anger that arrives calm. That's what I felt then. You already explained. No, I didn't. Not really. Her voice trembled badly. I was desperate. I shut the consultation room door behind me. So was I. More silence. Then she said something that made my stomach turn cold. You don't understand what it's like worrying about losing everything. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I understood that feeling perfectly. I'd lived with it for years. The difference was simple. I never stole from family to survive. You watched me struggle, I said quietly. You sat at this year's Easter dinner while I worried whether I could afford my prescriptions. I meant to pay it back. You keep saying that. I did. Her voice rose defensively. My father was sick. My brother needed a place to stay. Things spiraled. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. For the first time, I realized Vanessa truly believed her reasons justified what she'd done. That frightened me more than the theft itself. Because people who justify betrayal usually repeat it. Did you ever feel guilty? I asked softly. That question seemed to catch her off guard. Finally, she answered in almost a whisper. At first. At first, I felt something inside me harden permanently then. Not rage, not revenge, acceptance. Vanessa had crossed a line most families never recover from. And deep down, I think she knew it too. Before hanging up, she said one final thing. Daniel won't forgive me if you turn him against me. I stood there silently for several seconds after the call ended. Then I looked down at my shaking hands and realized something important. She still thought this was about money. But it wasn't. Not anymore. Now it was about trust. And once trust dies inside a family, something else usually dies with it. The following Sunday, Daniel came to my house alone. I knew Vanessa wasn't with him the moment I heard only one car door close outside. For a few seconds, I stood frozen at the kitchen sink, drying the same plate over and over while snow melted slowly against the windows. Part of me still hoped this entire mess would somehow disappear, that I'd wake up and discover there had been some terrible misunderstanding. But deep down, I already knew better. Families don't break all at once. They crack quietly first. Then one day, the damage finally becomes impossible to ignore. When I opened the front door, Daniel looked exhausted. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes, and his usually perfect hair looked hastily combed for the first time in years. He held a grocery bag awkwardly in one hand. "I brought coffee," he said softly. "From that bakery you like downtown." The fact he remembered my favorite coffee nearly made me cry. Not because it was a grand gesture, because it reminded me my son was still somewhere underneath all this distance. I stepped aside silently too. Let him in. The house smelled faintly like cinnamon candles and old books. Frank used to say our home always smelled safe. Now it mostly smelled lonely. Daniel set the coffee on the counter and glanced around the kitchen carefully. His eyes lingered on the old cabinets Frank installed himself 20 years earlier. The faded curtains above the sink. The ancient microwave humming softly on the counter. I suddenly realized he hadn't really looked at this house in years. Not truly. "Mom," he started quietly. But I shook my head. "Sit first." We sat at the small kitchen table where I'd spent countless mornings helping him with homework as a boy. Back then, he used to swing his legs beneath the chair while struggling through multiplication tables. Now he sat across from me in a $1,000 wool coat looking completely lost. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Daniel slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a cashier's check. $42,000. My hands froze instantly. "Daniel, it's yours." I stared at the number, so long it blurred slightly. $42,000. Enough to change my life overnight. Enough to erase years of fear. But instead of relief, I felt strangely numb. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can." "No." I pushed the envelope back gently. "That money already came from you once." His jaw tightened. "Mom, please don't protect me from this." That sentence hurt because he was right. Mothers spend decades cushioning consequences for their children, even grown ones. Daniel leaned forward slowly, rubbing both hands together nervously. "I met with a lawyer yesterday." I looked up sharply. "And?" She admitted everything. Of course she had. There wasn't much left to deny anymore. "She changed the banking information herself," he continued quietly. "Used her cousin's address for the account. Her parents have been living in the condo I bought for you." The condo. I'd almost forgotten about that part in all the chaos. "You bought me a condo?" Daniel looked physically ill hearing the question. "It was supposed to be your retirement gift." Retirement. The word nearly broke me. I thought about all the mornings I dragged myself out of bed before sunrise because I couldn't afford not to work. All the evenings my knees ached behind the reception desk while I smiled politely at patients. And all that time, my son believed I was living comfortably in a lakeside condo. "Why didn't you visit it?" I asked softly. The moment the words left my mouth, regret hit me immediately. Daniel flinched. And suddenly we were no longer talking about money anymore. We were talking about absence. About missed years. "I thought you wanted space," he admitted quietly. "Vanessa always said you were busy. Or traveling. Or spending time with church friends." I stared at him in disbelief. Traveling? I hadn't taken a vacation in nearly 9 years. The closest thing I'd had to travel was driving 40 minutes to a cardiologist appointment. Slowly, painful little memories began connecting together. The birthdays he skipped. The holidays shortened unexpectedly. The missed calls. How many of those moments were manipulated before they even reached me? And how many happened simply because Daniel stopped trying hard enough? That was the harder question. Because blaming Vanessa entirely would have been easier. But marriages only gain that much control when someone allows it. I should have checked myself, Daniel whispered suddenly, almost reading my thoughts. I should have come here more. Neither of us spoke after that. The silence between mothers and sons is different from other silences. It carries years inside it. Finally, Daniel looked toward the living room where Frank's photograph still sat above the fireplace. I keep thinking about Dad, he said quietly. So do I. He would hate me right now. I swallowed hard. Frank adored Daniel. But Frank also believed loyalty mattered more than comfort. He'd hate what happened, I corrected gently. Daniel nodded slowly, though guilt still sat heavily across his face. Then he reached into his coat pocket again and pulled out a second envelope. This one thinner. What's that? He hesitated before answering. Divorce papers. I blinked at him. So fast. His laugh sounded hollow. You don't come back from this, Mom. Part of me wanted to disagree. Marriage is complicated. People survive betrayal sometimes. But another part of me remembered Vanessa's voice on the phone. At first, not I'm sorry. Not I hate myself for hurting you. At first, that wasn't guilt. That was inconvenience. What happens to her now? I asked quietly. Daniel stared down at the untouched coffee cups between us. She says I'm destroying our marriage over money. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was again. Money. Even now, she still didn't understand. She stole trust, I said softly. That's different. Daniel looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I don't think I really knew my own wife. I understood that feeling better than he realized. Because I was beginning to wonder something painful myself. How much of my son had disappeared over the years, and how much had simply changed while I kept pretending not to notice. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the yard Frank once shoveled every winter before dawn. The world looked peaceful, but inside that little kitchen, something enormous had shifted forever. And for the first time since Thanksgiving night, I realized this story was only beginning. 3 days later, I saw Vanessa for the first time since Thanksgiving. I almost didn't recognize her. Not because she looked different physically, because the confidence was gone. She stood outside my dental office just after closing time, wearing a long black coat and oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. Her hands were shoved deep into her pockets against the cold. For a second, I considered pretending not to see her. I was tired. Tired in the kind of way sleep doesn't fix. But something in her posture stopped me. Not weakness. Desperation. Margaret, she said softly as I approached. I tightened my grip on my purse instinctively. The parking lot around us was nearly empty except for Dr. Klein's silver sedan near the back fence. Snow from the previous storm still sat piled along the curbs in gray frozen heaps. What are you doing here? I need to talk to you. I let out a slow breath through my nose. We already talked. No, she said quickly. Daniel won't listen to me anymore. There it was. Not I miss him. Not I'm ashamed. Daniel won't listen. Even now, her focus stayed on losing control. I adjusted my scarf tighter around my neck. It's cold. Please. Just 5 minutes. Part of me wanted to walk away, but another part needed answers. Not about the money anymore. About the years. We ended up sitting inside a tiny coffee shop 2 blocks from my office. The place smelled like burnt espresso and cinnamon muffins. Christmas music played softly through old ceiling speakers while college students typed on laptops near the windows. Vanessa wrapped both hands around a paper coffee cup, but barely drank from it. For almost a full minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked up. Daniel filed for divorce yesterday. Her voice cracked slightly. I felt sadness then, not satisfaction. Because no matter what happened, this was still the woman my son once loved enough to marry. I'm sorry things reached this point, I said quietly. Vanessa laughed bitterly. You're kinder than I deserve. That surprised me. It was the first honest thing she'd said since Thanksgiving. She stared down into her coffee for several seconds before speaking again. You probably think I'm some monster. I didn't answer immediately, because truthfully, I didn't know what I thought anymore. I think, I said carefully. People become dangerous when they convince themselves desperation excuses cruelty. Her eyes filled slowly with tears. My family was falling apart, she whispered. I stayed silent. And suddenly the words started pouring out of her. Her father's failed construction business. Credit card debt. Medical collections. Her younger brother sleeping on their parents' couch with 2 children after losing his apartment. I panicked, she admitted quietly. Then once the money started coming, it became easier to lie. That sentence chilled me more than anything else. Because evil rarely begins dramatically. Usually, it begins with convenience. I told myself you didn't really need it, she continued, wiping her eyes quickly. You always acted fine. I looked at her for a long moment. You know why older women act fine? She shook her head silently. Because nobody comes when we admit we're not. Her face crumpled. Slightly after that, for the first time since all this started, she looked genuinely ashamed. Outside the coffee shop window, snow drifted softly through the darkening streetlights. Vanessa lowered her voice. The condo was beautiful. I felt my chest tighten instantly. Beautiful. A home I never even saw. She swallowed hard before continuing. Daniel picked everything himself. The kitchen tiles, the furniture, even the reading chair near the lake window because he remembered how much you liked sitting outside with books. I looked away immediately before she could see tears gathering in my eyes. That hurt more than the theft itself somehow. Knowing my son had tried to take care of me. Knowing he thought he already had. He visited sometimes, Vanessa admitted softly. Not often, but enough to check on things. I turned back toward her slowly. What did you tell him? That you preferred privacy. Her voice dropped lower. That retirement made you happier alone. A strange numbness spread through me then. All those years I believed my son slowly stopped needing me. And all along, someone had been rewriting our relationship behind the scenes. Not entirely. Daniel still made his own choices. But manipulation works best when it mixes lies with tiny pieces of truth. You isolated him from me, I whispered. Vanessa started crying quietly then. I didn't mean for it to go that far. But it already had. That was the tragedy. You can't quietly poison family bonds for years and expect them to survive untouched. After a long silence, she reached carefully into her purse and slid a small silver key across the table. I stared at it in confusion. The condo, she whispered. It's still legally yours. My fingers froze beside the table. What? Daniel transferred it to your name from the beginning. The paperwork was real. She looked down ashamed. I intercepted the mail before you ever saw it. The key sat between us under the warm coffee shop lights like something unreal. A home. My home. Somewhere out there by a lake I'd never visited. I suddenly thought about all the nights I sat wrapped in blankets trying to save heating costs while a fully furnished condo sat waiting for me less than 2 hours away. The cruelty of that nearly took my breath away. Vanessa wiped at her face again. I know saying sorry means nothing now. No, it didn't. Because apologies arrive after damage. Not before. But strangely, sitting across from her there in that little coffee shop, I realized something important. Vanessa wasn't the powerful villain I imagined for years. She was weak. Weak enough to steal. Weak enough to justify it. Weak enough to slowly destroy her own marriage rather than face hardship honestly. And somehow that made everything even sadder. Before leaving, she whispered one final thing. He still loves you very much, Margaret. I stared down at the silver condo key resting in my palm after she walked away. Then I looked out at the snowy street and realized something heartbreaking. For years, I thought my son abandoned me. But maybe the truth was even more painful. Maybe someone had been standing between us the entire time, quietly making sure I stayed alone. I didn't tell Daniel about meeting Vanessa. Not right away. Some things need silence before they make sense. For 3 days, the silver condo key stayed on my kitchen counter beside the sugar bowl. Every morning before work, I stared at it while waiting for my coffee to brew. A key to a life I was supposed to have. A life someone else quietly stole. By Friday afternoon, I finally decided to see the condo for myself. The drive took just under 2 hours north of Columbus, near a small lake town called Cedar Hollow. Snow covered the roadsides in soft white blankets, and bare tree branches stretched over the highway like dark veins against the winter sky. The farther I drove, the quieter everything became. I kept gripping the steering wheel tighter the closer I got. Part of me was excited. Another part was terrified. Because what if seeing the condo made everything hurt even more? When I finally turned into the neighborhood, I nearly missed the entrance. It wasn't flashy. Just a peaceful little lakeside community with stone pathways and soft yellow porch lights glowing against the snow. The sign near the entrance read, Lakeview Pines. I sat in my car for a full minute staring through the windshield. Then I looked down at the key trembling slightly in my hand. Unit 14B. Second floor. Lake facing. The hallway smelled faintly like pine cleaner and fresh paint. My boots echoed softly against the polished floors as I walked toward the door. 14B. For a second, I couldn't breathe. This place had existed for over a year. Mine. And yet I'd spent that same year clipping coupons for groceries. I slowly slid the key into the lock. The door opened immediately. Warm air greeted me first. Then silence. I stepped inside carefully. And froze. The condo was beautiful. Not extravagant. Thoughtful. Soft beige walls. Cream-colored couches. A knitted throw blanket folded neatly over the armchair beside the window. Framed Lake photographs hanging along the hallway. My eyes landed on the bookshelf near the fireplace. Every single shelf held books I loved. Mystery novels. Historical biographies. Even the gardening magazines Frank used to tease me for collecting. I pressed one shaking hand against my mouth. Daniel remembered. He remembered all of it. Slowly, I walked toward the large window overlooking the frozen lake. Snow drifted lightly across the water while tiny lights reflected from docks along the shore. And there beside the window sat a dark green reading chair with a small brass lamp beside it. Exactly the kind of chair I always wanted. I lowered myself into it carefully and suddenly burst into tears. Not loud dramatic crying. The quiet kind older women do alone. Because the room felt like proof of two completely different truths existing at once. My son loved me enough to build this life for me. But somehow, I still ended up abandoned. After a while, I finally stood and explored the rest of the condo. The bedroom held fresh linen still folded neatly inside drawers. The kitchen pantry was stocked with canned soup, tea bags, crackers, and even my favorite hazelnut coffee. Everything looked prepared, ready, as if someone expected me to walk through the door at any moment. I opened the freezer and found frozen blueberry waffles. That broke me all over again. When Daniel was 8 years old, we used to make blueberry waffles every Saturday morning because it was the only breakfast Frank knew how to cook properly. How could someone remember tiny things like that and still stay away so long? By sunset, I finally sat down at the kitchen island and called Daniel. He answered immediately. "Mom, I'm at the condo." Silence. Then a shaky breath on the other end. "You found it?" "Yes." Another long silence stretched between us. Finally, I asked softly, "Why blueberry waffles?" I heard him laugh weakly through tears. Dad used to burn the first batch every single time. I closed my eyes instantly. For one small moment, it felt like we were a family again. Not broken, not distant. Just mother and son remembering the same kitchen 25 years earlier. "I thought you hated me," I admitted quietly before I could stop myself. Daniel's breathing caught sharply. "Mom, I know that sounds childish at my age," I continued softly. "But after enough canceled visits and forgotten holidays, you start wondering." His voice cracked completely then. "I never hated you. But you stopped coming. I thought you stopped needing me." That sentence settled heavily inside my chest. Because there it was again. The terrible misunderstanding Vanessa had fed for years. "She told me you loved your independence," he whispered. "Every time I wanted to visit, she'd say you were busy with church groups or traveling with friends." I looked around the condo slowly. A fully prepared home waiting in silence. "I wasn't traveling," I said quietly. "I know that now." There was so much pain in his voice that I suddenly felt guilty too. Not for what happened, but for how easily distance grows when nobody checks the truth anymore. Families don't collapse from one lie. They collapse from thousands of tiny silences. Daniel cleared his throat softly. "Are you staying there tonight?" I glanced toward the lake outside the window. The condo felt peaceful. Safe. Like the life Frank always wanted for me after retirement. "Yes," I whispered. "Good." Another silence. Then Daniel said something unexpected. "I fired my financial manager this morning." "What?" He admitted Vanessa pressured him not to contact you directly about the transfers. I sat upright immediately. "What do you mean?" "He thought you already knew about the condo. She told him you preferred privacy." Daniel's voice turned colder. Apparently more people knew pieces of this than I realized. That sent a chill through me. Because suddenly this wasn't just one woman making selfish decisions anymore. It was an entire web of ignored warning signs. How many people knew I wasn't there? I whispered. Daniel didn't answer immediately. And somehow, that silence told me enough. That night, I slept in the condo for the first time. The mattress felt unfamiliar but soft beneath my aching back. Outside, snow fell quietly across the frozen lake while wind rattled gently against the windows. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about heating bills, or overdue notices, or whether I could afford groceries next week. But somehow peace still felt complicated. Because lying awake in that beautiful condo, I kept thinking the same painful thought over and over again. How many years had already been stolen from us before either of us finally noticed? I stayed at the condo for the rest of the weekend. By Sunday morning, the lake outside had frozen almost completely, turning silver beneath the pale winter sunlight. I sat beside the big window wrapped in the knitted blanket Daniel had apparently chosen himself, holding a mug of coffee in both hands. For the first time in years, I felt warm without worrying about the utility bill. But comfort can feel strange after surviving too long in survival mode. Every little luxury made me emotional. The heated bathroom floors, the soft lighting beneath the kitchen cabinets, even the refrigerator filled with groceries I didn't have to calculate carefully in my head. I kept thinking the same thing over and over. This was supposed to be my life. Around noon, someone knocked softly at the condo door. I frowned immediately. Daniel had texted earlier saying he was still in Chicago handling legal meetings. Nobody else should have known I was here. For one nervous moment, I wondered if it was Vanessa. But when I opened the door, I found an older man holding a small toolbox. Gray beard, flannel jacket, kind eyes. Well, he said warmly, you finally made it. I blinked in confusion. I'm sorry. He smiled awkwardly. I'm Walter, building maintenance. He lifted the toolbox slightly. Daniel said his mother would eventually move in. But after a year, we figured maybe plans changed. Something tightened painfully in my chest. A year. Walter nodded. He came up here all the time at first. I stared at him silently. Your son decorated half this place himself, he continued with a soft laugh. Nearly drove the furniture delivery guys crazy rearranging that reading chair by the window. I looked instinctively toward the green chair again. Walter stepped carefully inside after I invited him in from the cold. I'm just checking the heating unit filters, he explained. Winter's rough around the lake. As he worked quietly near the hallway closet, he kept talking casually. Daniel always asked us to keep an eye on the condo. Said his mother deserved someplace peaceful after losing her husband. I swallowed hard. Frank. Even hearing strangers mention him still hurt. Walter glanced back toward me kindly. He talked about you a lot. That nearly broke me again. Because for years, I convinced myself my son slowly forgot about me. But apparently strangers by a lake knew my favorite reading chair before I even knew the condo existed. He used to come sit by the water for hours, Walter continued. Especially after arguments with his wife. My chest tightened immediately. Arguments. So things hadn't been perfect for a while. Walter hesitated, then lowered his voice slightly. Honestly, ma'am, folks around here always wondered about her. I looked up sharply. Vanessa? He nodded carefully. She never seemed happy you were supposed to move in. A cold feeling crept slowly through me. How do you mean? Walter looked uncomfortable suddenly, like he regretted saying too much. She complained a lot, he admitted. Said the condo was wasted on someone who preferred living small anyway. I stared at him in disbelief. Preferred living small. As though poverty had been some charming little lifestyle choice. Walter shook his head quietly while tightening something near the heater vent. Didn't sit right with me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something else that changed everything. One time I asked where you were, and she told me you declined the condo because you didn't want charity. I felt physically sick. That explained so much. All those years Daniel believed he was respecting my independence while I quietly struggled alone. Vanessa hadn't just stolen money. She rewrote the story between mother and son. When Walter finally left, I sat motionless on the couch staring at the frozen lake outside. The condo suddenly felt different now. Not just painful, haunted. Every corner held proof of years lost to manipulation. The bookshelf Daniel arranged. The blankets he picked. The kitchen utensils he bought because he remembered Frank loved cooking breakfasts on Sundays. This place wasn't just a gift. It was an apology I never received because someone intercepted it before it reached me. Around 4 that afternoon, Daniel called again. How's the condo? He asked carefully. I looked around slowly. It's beautiful. He let out a quiet breath. I'm glad. There was hesitation in his voice. Then he asked softly, did you meet Walter? I blinked in surprise. How did you know? He texted me. Daniel gave a weak laugh. That man knows everybody's business in Cedar Hollow. For the first time in days, I smiled slightly. Then my expression faded again. Daniel, how bad were things between you and Vanessa before Thanksgiving? Silence. Long enough to tell me the answer already mattered. Finally, he sighed heavily. Worse than I admitted. I stayed quiet. And slowly, painfully, the truth started coming out. The fights about money. The arguments whenever he mentioned visiting me. The way Vanessa constantly insisted I wanted space. I thought marriage just got harder after a while, he admitted quietly. I kept making excuses. That hurt to hear. Not because he was cruel. Because he sounded tired. Like a man who'd been emotionally managed for years without realizing it. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. She wanted me to sell the condo 6 months ago. I sat upright instantly. What? She said keeping it empty was financially irresponsible. His voice turned colder. Turns out her brother was trying to buy a house around the same time. I closed my eyes slowly. Of course. Even now, the greed kept unfolding layer after layer. How close was she to selling it? He paused. Pretty close. A chill ran through me despite the warm condo. If Thanksgiving dinner never happened, if Daniel never casually asked that one question, I might have lost everything permanently without ever knowing. The condo, the money, even the relationship with my son, all erased quietly while I blamed myself for growing old and lonely. Outside, snow began falling again across the frozen lake. Soft, silent, beautiful, the kind of snowfall that hides damage beneath something peaceful. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. Families can break the same way, quietly, slowly, until one honest question finally exposes everything underneath. By the second week of December, I had started splitting my time between my old house in Columbus and the condo at Lakeview Pines. Every Friday after work, I packed a small overnight bag and drove north toward the lake. At first, the condo still felt borrowed somehow. Too quiet, too beautiful, like I was waiting for someone to tell me there'd been another mistake. But slowly, little pieces of me began settling there. I bought a small plant for the kitchen windowsill, placed framed photos of Frank beside the fireplace, folded my favorite cardigan over the green reading chair near the lake window. For the first time in years, I wasn't simply surviving week to week. And that terrified me more than I expected. Because when people live in survival mode too long, peace can feel unfamiliar. One snowy Saturday morning, I was organizing kitchen drawers when my phone rang. Daniel. Mom, he said carefully. Can I come up there? I paused immediately. Of course. 2 hours later, his SUV pulled into the parking lot outside the condo. This time when I opened the door, he didn't look like a successful businessman. He looked exhausted, unshaven, hollow-eyed, carrying too much guilt. He stepped inside slowly and looked around the condo again like he was seeing it properly for the first time in years. You made it. Feel like home, he said softly. I smiled faintly. It already was. I just finally arrived. Something painful crossed his face at that. We sat beside the lake window while snow drifted softly outside. I made coffee, and for a while we talked about ordinary things. Work, weather, a neighbor downstairs who apparently complained constantly about parking spaces. It felt strangely nice. Simple, like we were relearning each other carefully after years apart. Then Daniel finally spoke the words sitting between us all morning. She emptied our joint savings account. I looked up sharply. What? 2 days after Thanksgiving. His jaw tightened. Almost $90,000. I stared at him in disbelief. 90,000. She transferred it to an account connected to her brother. For several seconds, I couldn't even process the number. The greed just kept growing larger every time I learned something new. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face tiredly. The lawyers think she panicked after realizing everything was collapsing. Did she disappear? No. She's staying with her parents at the condo. I froze instantly. The condo. Daniel nodded bitterly. They refused to leave. A cold heaviness settled into my stomach. My condo. The place I should have lived in for over a year. Still occupied by the people who helped steal from me. What are you going to do? He stared out at the frozen lake. I honestly don't know anymore. And suddenly, for the first time since all this began, I saw something beyond anger in my son. Shame. Not just toward Vanessa. Toward himself. Daniel, I said quietly. You didn't know. I should have. His voice cracked hard enough that he stopped speaking for a second. Then he continued softly. I kept choosing the easier explanation every time. That sentence sat heavily between us. Because he was right. It had been easier to believe I wanted distance. Easier to assume aging mothers naturally become smaller parts of their children's lives. Easier to trust his wife than ask uncomfortable questions. I failed you, he whispered. Hearing your child say that hurts in a strange way. Even when it's true, part of you still wants to protect them from their own guilt. I reached across the table slowly and placed my hand over his. You failed to notice, I corrected gently. That's different. His eyes filled immediately. Outside, wind swept snow across the frozen lake in soft white spirals. Daniel looked down at our hands for a long moment before speaking again. She says I ruined her life. I let out a quiet breath. That's what people say when consequences arrive. He gave a weak laugh at that. Then his expression darkened again. There's something else. The tone in his voice instantly made my stomach tighten. What? She contacted your office. I blinked. What do you mean? She called your boss 3 days ago pretending to be worried about your mental health. Cold shock spread through my chest. She what? Daniel nodded grimly. She claimed you were confused lately. Said you were forgetting financial information and struggling emotionally after Frank's death. For one terrifying moment, I couldn't speak. Because suddenly I understood exactly what Vanessa had been trying to do. Build a story. An older widow. Confused. Forgetful. Financially unstable. The kind of story people believe too easily about aging women. She was preparing excuses, I whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. In case this ever became legal. I stood up abruptly and walked toward the lake window because suddenly sitting still felt impossible. Outside, the world looked calm and beautiful. Inside me, something colder was forming. Not fear anymore. Awareness. Vanessa hadn't simply lied impulsively. She'd been quietly constructing protection for herself for a long time. She underestimated you, Daniel said softly behind me. I stared out at the frozen lake for several seconds before answering. No, I turned toward him slowly. She underestimated old women. That silence after my words felt important somehow. Because for years, I'd accepted being overlooked. Invisible. Dismissed. Like aging quietly meant surrendering authority over my own life. But now I understood something different. People often mistake kindness for weakness, especially in older women. Daniel stood and walked beside me near the window. We're filing fraud. Charges Monday. I closed my eyes briefly. This was real now. Lawyers. Police reports. Courts. The destruction of a marriage. The destruction of trust. And somehow the saddest part still wasn't the money. It was knowing that someone sat at my holiday table for years pretending to love this family, while quietly dismantling it piece by piece behind the scenes. That night after Daniel left, I stood alone beside the frozen lake watching snow fall beneath the parking lot lights. The condo felt warm behind me. Safe. Finally mine. But deep down, I knew peace still hadn't arrived yet. Because the truth had only just started surfacing. And families built on lies rarely collapse quietly once everything comes into the light. The following Monday, I took the day off work for the first time in almost 8 months. At 7 that morning, I sat at the condo kitchen island staring at the lake while snow drifted quietly across the frozen water. My coffee had gone cold beside me, untouched. In 2 hours, Daniel and I were meeting with attorneys. Real attorneys. Not just angry conversations anymore. Not family arguments that eventually fade during holidays. This had become something official. Something permanent. I never imagined at 68 years old I'd be preparing fraud documents against my own daughter-in-law. Life can become unrecognizable very quickly. Daniel arrived shortly before 9. He looked calmer than he had the previous weekend, but it wasn't peace. It was resolve. There's a difference. He carried a thick leather folder beneath one arm and set it carefully on the kitchen table. What's all that? I asked quietly. Everything we could recover. Bank transfers. Property documents. Emails. Phone records. A timeline of 14 months of lies laid neatly inside labeled folders. I stared at the paperwork silently while Daniel removed his coat. You don't have to come today if it's too much, he said gently. I almost smiled. Women my age hear that sentence often once people think we're fragile. Too much. Too emotional. Too overwhelmed. But surviving hardship for decades teaches you something important. You can endure almost anything once you've already endured. Loneliness. No, I said calmly. I'm coming. The lawyer's office sat downtown overlooking the river. Tall glass windows. Quiet marble lobby. Everything smelled faintly like coffee and printer paper. Daniel's attorney, Patricia Wells, greeted us warmly. She was probably in her early 50s. Sharp eyes. Gray streaks through dark hair. The kind of woman who looked like she noticed everything immediately. After introductions, She opened the main folder slowly. Mrs. Harper, she said carefully, I need to ask a difficult question. I folded my hands quietly in my lap. All right. Did you ever authorize Vanessa Collins to manage your finances in any way? No. Did you ever verbally approve use of your bank identity or personal information? Never. Patricia nodded slowly while making notes. Then she slid several printed screenshots across the table. Emails. Supposedly from me. I stared at them in shock. The messages discussed account changes, retirement preferences, even fake travel plans. One claimed I wanted minimal contact while adjusting to widowhood. Another stated I was considering long-term independent living. My chest tightened painfully. She wrote all this. Patricia exchanged a brief glance with Daniel. We believe so. The room suddenly felt colder. Because these weren't just financial lies. They were emotional lies, carefully designed to isolate me from my own son. Daniel leaned forward heavily, elbows against his knees. I don't understand how I missed this. Patricia looked at him calmly. Manipulative people rarely operate loudly, she said. They create believable narratives slowly. I stared again at the fake emails. Minimal contact. Independent living. Traveling with church friends. It amazed me how easily older women disappear once someone starts telling the world we prefer solitude. Nobody questions it. People expect elderly widows to become smaller over time. Quieter. More isolated. Vanessa used that assumption perfectly. Patricia opened another folder carefully. There's more. My stomach dropped instantly. What now? The condo association records. Daniel closed his eyes briefly like he already knew what was coming. Patricia continued gently. Several complaints were filed over the past year regarding unauthorized occupants in your condo. I blinked in confusion. Unauthorized. She allowed multiple family members to stay there temporarily. Temporarily. That word almost made me laugh. According to records, Vanessa's brother, his wife, their children, and even her parents rotated through the condo for months. My condo. The home my son bought, so I could finally rest after decades of working. Used like a free family hotel while I rationed medication. I looked down at my trembling hands. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, anger finally arrived fully. Not explosive anger. The cold kind. The dangerous kind. Daniel noticed immediately. Mom, they all knew. I asked quietly. Neither Patricia nor Daniel answered immediately. That silence hurt more than the answer itself. Because suddenly I realized this deception had become normal inside Vanessa's family. Acceptable. Shared. They slept in my home. Used my kitchen. Watched sunsets beside my lake. And apparently nobody once asked, where is Daniel's mother? That realization changed something inside me permanently. Patricia gently slid another paper across the table. This is important, she said carefully. It was a drafted statement from Vanessa's attorney. My eyes scanned the page slowly. Claims about emotional instability. Confusion after bereavement. Difficulty managing finances independently. I stared at the words for several long seconds before speaking. She's trying to paint me as mentally incompetent. Patricia nodded quietly. In anticipation of legal exposure, yes. Daniel suddenly slammed his hand against the conference table hard enough to make me jump. This is insane. But strangely, I remained calm. Because now everything finally made sense. The phone call to my boss. The stories about forgetfulness. The fake concern. She wasn't just protecting stolen money anymore. She was building a version of me nobody would question. An aging widow struggling emotionally after loss. The kind of woman society politely stops listening to. I want to proceed, I said quietly. Daniel looked at me carefully. Mom, once this starts. It already started 14 months ago. The room fell silent after that. Patricia slowly nodded. All right. For the next 2 hours, we signed documents. Fraud reports. Property recovery requests. Financial investigations. Every signature felt surreal. I kept thinking about Frank. About how hard we worked our entire lives for stability. And how quickly trust can destroy what money never could. When the meeting finally ended, Daniel and I stood together outside the office building watching snow drift along the riverfront sidewalks. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then he said quietly, I think I lost my marriage long before Thanksgiving. I looked at him carefully. No, I answered softly. You lost at the moment honesty stopped living inside it. His eyes filled slightly after that. Then he surprised me by reaching for my hand the same way he used to when he was little crossing busy parking lots. For the first time in years, my son held my hand again. And standing there in the cold December air, I realized something unexpected. Vanessa stole money. She stole time. She almost stole family. But she failed to erase one thing completely: the bond between a mother and her child. Even damaged love can survive, as long as truth finally reaches it before it's too late. A week after meeting with the lawyers, Daniel asked me to come back to Columbus for what he called one final conversation. The way he said it told me everything already. This wasn't reconciliation. This was closure. The meeting happened at our old family home. Not mine. Not Vanessa's. Daniel's house. The same house where I once helped paint the nursery before my grandson Ethan was born. The same kitchen where we celebrated birthdays and Christmas mornings before everything quietly fell apart. Snow covered the front lawn when I arrived that evening. The neighborhood looked peaceful, glowing softly beneath holiday lights hanging from nearby porches. But inside that house, nothing felt warm anymore. Daniel opened the door before I even knocked. He looked thinner, tired in a deeper way now. Not shocked anymore. Worn down. "She's here," he said quietly. I nodded once and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly like coffee and stress. Half-packed cardboard boxes sat stacked near the staircase. Family photographs had been removed from several walls, leaving pale, empty rectangles behind. That hurt more than I expected. A dismantled home always feels like grief. Vanessa sat at the dining room table wearing a cream sweater I'd seen before during one of our Thanksgiving dinners years ago. Her makeup was perfect, but her eyes looked swollen from crying. Beside her sat a man in a navy suit. Her attorney. Of course. The moment I saw him, I understood immediately. This wasn't a family discussion anymore. It was damage control. "Margaret," Vanessa said softly as I entered. I gave a small polite nod but didn't answer. At my age, you learn silence can say more than arguments ever will. Daniel pulled out a chair for me across the table. Nobody touched the coffee sitting untouched between us. Finally, Vanessa's attorney cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harper, thank you for agreeing to meet." I folded my hands quietly in my lap. "I'm only here because my son asked me to come." The attorney nodded professionally. "Of course. My client is hoping we can resolve matters privately before further legal escalation." Legal escalation. Such clean words for ugly betrayal. Daniel stared down at the table silently, while Vanessa twisted her wedding ring nervously around her finger. Then she finally spoke. "I know I destroyed trust." Destroyed. Interesting choice of words. Not damaged. Destroyed. But I want to make this right. I looked at her carefully for several seconds. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "When were you planning to tell me?" Her face immediately crumpled. "That's not fair." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because fairness suddenly mattered to her only after consequences arrived. "You watched me struggle for over a year," I said quietly. "You watched me work full-time at 68 years old, while living inside property meant for me." Tears slid down her cheeks instantly. "I know." "No," I replied softly. "You understood. That's different." The room fell silent again. Outside, snow tapped gently against the dining room windows while Christmas lights blinked quietly across neighboring houses. It felt strange discussing fraud beside holiday decorations. Then Vanessa said something that changed the entire room. "I was pregnant." Daniel froze beside me. "What?" Her attorney closed his eyes briefly like he wished she hadn't said it that way. Vanessa wiped quickly beneath her eyes. "I found out 2 weeks before Thanksgiving." I stared at her in shock. Pregnant. For one dizzy second, emotions collided inside me so quickly I couldn't sort them apart. Confusion. Sadness. Anger. Hope. Daniel looked physically sick. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because everything was already falling apart." Her voice shook violently now. "And after Thanksgiving, I lost the baby." Silence swallowed the room whole. Even the attorney looked uncomfortable suddenly. I lowered my eyes slowly toward the table. There are moments in life where pain becomes too complicated for simple sides. Because no matter what Vanessa had done, losing a child is still losing a child. Daniel leaned back heavily in his chair, pressing both hands against his face. "Oh my God." Vanessa started crying harder then. Not dramatic crying. Broken crying. "I know everyone thinks I'm evil," she whispered. "But everything spiraled so fast. My parents needed help. My brother needed money. Then I got pregnant and panicked because I thought if Daniel found out everything, I'd lose my family." Her words filled the room softly, messily, humanly, and that somehow made this harder instead of easier. Because monsters are easier to hate than damaged people. I sat quietly for a long time before finally speaking. You didn't lose your family because of fear. Vanessa looked up slowly. You lost it because you kept choosing deception after every opportunity to stop. Fresh tears rolled down her face immediately. Beside me, Daniel still hadn't moved. I think part of him was mourning multiple things at once. His marriage, the baby, the woman he thought he married. Eventually, Vanessa's attorney carefully slid a folder across the table. A settlement proposal, he explained quietly. Inside were signed agreements. Full surrender of financial claims. Repayment arrangements. Voluntary. Removal from the condo. No contest to the fraud investigation. I looked through the pages slowly, then stopped at one line near the bottom. Formal written apology. I almost smiled sadly. You cannot legalize remorse. Daniel finally spoke after nearly 20 minutes of silence. I don't recognize our life anymore. Nobody answered him because there was nothing left to say. That's the terrible thing about betrayal. By the time truth fully arrives, the damage has usually already finished unfolding. When the meeting ended, Vanessa stood slowly as I gathered my coat. Margaret, she whispered softly. I turned toward her one final time. I really did love this family. For a second, I believed she meant it. That was the tragedy. People can love you and still destroy you through selfishness. I looked at her quietly before answering. Love without honesty becomes something dangerous. Then I walked out into the falling snow beside my son. And for the first time in months, neither of us looked back at the house behind us. Christmas arrived quietly that year. No big family dinner. No crowded living room filled with wrapping paper and grandchildren laughing beside the tree. Just me and Daniel at the condo by the lake. And honestly, after everything that happened, quiet felt easier. The snow around Lakeview Pines looked untouched that morning, soft white covering the docks and frozen shoreline beneath a pale gray sky. Inside the condo, cinnamon candles burned near the fireplace, while Frank Sinatra played softly through the kitchen speaker Daniel had installed years earlier. Years earlier. That thought still hurts sometimes. So much love had existed here before I ever knew the place was mine. Daniel stood at the stove making blueberry waffles while muttering under his breath because he burned the first batch exactly the way Frank always used to. I smiled despite myself. There it is, I said softly. He glanced over his shoulder. What? The Harper family tradition. For the first time in weeks, he laughed normally. Not forced. Not exhausted. Real. And hearing my son laugh again felt like sunlight after a very long winter. But grief still sat quietly beneath everything. Not just grief over Vanessa. Grief over lost years. Over missed birthdays. Over misunderstandings that never needed to happen. After breakfast, Daniel handed me a small wrapped box. You didn't have to get me anything, I said immediately. I know. Inside was a framed photograph. Not new. Old. A picture from 23 years earlier at Cedar Point Amusement Park. Frank standing behind me with both hands on my shoulders while 8-year-old Daniel grinned, beside us holding melted ice cream all over his shirt. I stared at the photo silently. I found it in storage, Daniel said quietly. I don't know why we stopped displaying family pictures. I did. Because somewhere along the way, distance entered our lives slowly enough that nobody noticed until memories started disappearing too. That afternoon, while snow fell softly outside, Daniel finally told me the full truth about the investigation. Vanessa's parents had moved out of the condo 2 days earlier. Most of the money was already gone, spent on debts, vehicles, vacations, and helping relatives. There's almost nothing left to recover, he admitted quietly. Oddly enough, that no longer upset me the way it once would have. Money matters when you're surviving. But after a certain amount of heartbreak, numbers stop being the deepest wound. What about the criminal case? I asked carefully. Daniel stared down into his coffee. The district attorney is reviewing it. And Vanessa? She signed the settlement agreement. I nodded slowly. Then he added something softer. She wrote you a letter. That surprised me. A letter. He reached into the drawer beside the refrigerator and handed me a sealed envelope. My name sat carefully written across the front in Vanessa's familiar handwriting. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Then I opened it slowly. The letter wasn't dramatic. No excuses. No legal language. Just page after page of regret. She wrote about growing up in chaos. About spending most of her childhood afraid of losing housing whenever bills piled up. About how marrying Daniel made her feel safe for the first time in years. Then fear returned once her parents began collapsing financially. I kept telling. Myself, I was protecting family, one line read. But eventually I realized I was only protecting my own panic. I sat silently for a long time after finishing it. Finally, Daniel asked carefully, "What do you think?" I folded the letter slowly in my lap. "I think pain travels through generations if nobody stops it." He frowned slightly. "She hurt people because she was hurt." "Partly." I looked toward the frozen lake outside. "But being wounded doesn't excuse wounding others." That distinction mattered. A lot. Because too many people confuse explanation with forgiveness. Later that evening, Daniel helped me decorate the condo Christmas tree. Tiny white lights reflected softly against the lake windows while old ornaments filled the branches. Some belonged to Frank and me from decades earlier. Others Daniel apparently bought for the condo years ago while imagining future holidays here. One ornament nearly broke me completely. A little wooden canoe with Mom's lake house, painted carefully across the side. He'd bought it before Thanksgiving last year, while I was still struggling to pay heating bills. I held it gently between my fingers and suddenly started crying quietly. Daniel immediately stepped closer. "Mom, I lost so much time," I whispered. His expression crumbled instantly. "So did I." That was the tragedy neither of us could fix. Money can sometimes return. Trust can occasionally heal. But time only moves one direction. That night after dinner, we sat beside the fireplace watching old Christmas movies while snowstorms rolled across the lake outside. At one point, Daniel suddenly said, "I used to think success meant building a bigger life." I looked over at him. "But now," he continued softly, "I think success is knowing who's sitting at your table and whether they genuinely love you." I reached over and squeezed his hand gently. Because after everything, my son was finally learning the difference between appearance and truth. And honestly, so was I. Before bed, I stood alone for a while beside the condo window looking out across the frozen lake glowing beneath moonlight. 1 year earlier, I spent Christmas alone in my cold little house believing my son had simply moved on from me. Now I finally understood something painful. Love hadn't disappeared. It had been buried beneath lies. And sometimes the cruelest betrayals aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet manipulations that slowly convince people they've been forgotten, while someone else stands in the middle rewriting the story. By early spring, the lake had finally started to thaw. Thin cracks spread slowly across the ice each morning, and small patches of blue water shimmered beneath the sunlight for the first time in months. I used to sit beside the condo window every sunrise watching it happen. Healing looks quiet from a distance, almost invisible, but underneath, entire landscapes are changing. A lot had changed since Thanksgiving. The fraud investigation officially ended in February. Vanessa avoided criminal charges as part of the settlement agreement, mostly because Daniel pushed for restitution instead of prosecution. The condo was fully returned to me legally, along with what remained of the stolen funds. It wasn't everything, not even close. But strangely, I stopped caring about the money a long time ago. What mattered was truth. And truth had finally reached daylight. Daniel visited almost every weekend now. Not out of guilt anymore. Out of choice. That difference mattered more than he realized. Some Saturdays we cooked breakfast together. Other mornings we simply sat beside the lake drinking coffee while talking about ordinary things. Work stress, weather, old family memories. One afternoon he brought a dusty cardboard box from storage labeled "Mom and Dad." Inside were decades of forgotten photographs, vacation pictures, Christmas cards, drawings he made in elementary school. For hours we sat cross-legged on the living room floor, sorting through memories that should never have disappeared in the first place. At one point Daniel held up an old photo from his college graduation. Frank stood beside him proudly with one arm around my shoulders while I cried into a tissue because I was overwhelmed seeing our son become a man. "I forgot this picture existed," Daniel whispered. I smiled sadly. "No," I said softly. "You just stopped looking at it." That sentence hung gently between us because we both understood it wasn't only about photographs. Families don't disappear all at once. Sometimes people simply stop looking carefully enough to notice what's fading. A few weeks later, I made one final trip back to my old house in Columbus. The little place looked smaller than I remembered. The front porch sagged slightly near the railing Frank kept promising to repair before his heart gave out. The mailbox leaned crooked toward the sidewalk. Inside, the kitchen still carried faint traces of cinnamon and old coffee grounds. I stood alone in the living room for a long time. This house witnessed every version of my life. Young bride, new mother, worried widow, lonely old woman quietly eating canned soup beside unpaid bills. I thought I would feel anger walking through those rooms one last time. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Not weak tired. Finished tired. Like surviving something heavy for too long. When Daniel arrived later with boxes for the move, he found me standing beside Frank's old recliner near the window. "You okay?" he asked gently. I nodded. Then after a moment, I added, "I think I stayed here too long because I was afraid starting over meant admitting I'd been abandoned." Daniel's expression tightened painfully. "You weren't abandoned." I looked at him carefully. "No," I said softly, "but I believed I was." And honestly, that was the deepest wound Vanessa left behind. Not stolen money. Not legal paperwork. Not even the condo. She made me believe my own son stopped loving me. That kind of loneliness changes people slowly. But standing there in the old house beside my son, I finally understood something important. Love can survive distance. Sometimes even betrayal. But only if truth reaches it before bitterness does. We sold the house that spring. The young couple who bought it reminded me a little of Frank and me decades earlier. Nervous. Hopeful. Arguing politely over paint colors while pretending not to notice the roof repairs they'd probably have to make. Before handing over the keys, I stood alone inside one final time. The rooms echoed softly around me. So many birthdays. So many Christmas mornings. So many ordinary Tuesdays nobody realizes become precious until years later. I touched the kitchen counter gently and whispered goodbye to Frank under my breath. Then I walked away without looking back. That night at the condo, Daniel grilled burgers out on the small lakeside patio while sunset reflected gold across the water. The air smelled like spring rain and charcoal smoke. Peaceful, simple, real. After dinner, we sat quietly watching the lake while birds skimmed low across the water. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I still don't understand how everything got so far." I thought about that carefully before answering. Because betrayal rarely arrives looking dangerous. He looked over at me silently. It usually arrives dressed as convenience, or stress, or excuses people don't question quickly enough. He nodded slowly. Then after a long pause, he asked the question I think had haunted him for months. "Do you forgive her?" The lake water moved softly beneath the fading sunlight while I considered my answer. Finally, I spoke honestly. "I forgive her enough to stop carrying hatred." Daniel stayed quiet. "But forgiveness," I continued softly, "doesn't mean trust grows back." That distinction seemed to settle something inside him. For a while we simply listened to the water. Then he smiled faintly. "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "That stupid question at Thanksgiving." I laughed softly for the first time in what felt like forever. "Mom, are you happy in your new home?" We both shook our heads. One accidental question. That's all it took for the entire truth to finally surface. As darkness settled over the lake, I looked around the condo one last time. The reading chair by the window. Frank's photographs near the fireplace. My grandson's drawings taped proudly to the refrigerator after his first visit here in January. Home. Real home. Not because of money. Not because it was beautiful. Because loneliness no longer lived here anymore. And sitting there beside my son with spring arriving quietly across the lake, I realized something I wish more people understood before it's too late. The saddest part of growing older isn't wrinkles or grief or even losing people you love. It's realizing how easily silence can replace connection if nobody protects it. Families don't survive automatically. Love needs attention, truth, presence. And sometimes all it takes to save what's left is one honest question finally asked at the right moment.